Thank you so much for having me. You will realize that I do not agree with what my previous speaker just said, not with all of what he said, or what the former president of the Constitutional Court said. Maybe I'm in line with what Ms. Sanders said. I will try to counter what was said before in line with Swiss traditions and customs. So, the title of my presentation is An Alternative Model. There is an array of different models. I chose the one that I think is the most appropriate. This is my development. You could have developed it differently. It's like building bricks that you put together. My focus is on the federal system, the federal courts, not just the highest courts, the constitutional court, but also the lower courts. This is not an appropriate system for the Attorney General's office because this is completely different. And it can only be seen as an overview, of course. Last week, I published an article that you are invited to read with more details. I do not want to go into detail on that slide. Much has been said before. Two things I would like to mention, however. Judges have their own attitude, their own opinions, and this is okay. There aren't unpoliticized judges. And I believe this is one of the weaknesses of the judicial reform. It expects judges not to have any views at all. Of course, their focus is primarily on the judiciary, but they have a basic opinion and attitude and understanding of the world, and it will influence their decision-taking to some extent. It does not mean that the political parties should exert influence on the elections. That's a completely different question. I also want to highlight that in Switzerland, we have the tradition of election by parliaments and sometimes even by the people itself. This is a tradition. And this is because the judges are democratically legitimized. We do not have a tradition of co-optation, but this was mentioned before. I do not believe I need to explain the re-election processes. This has been done before. Where do I believe can the system be optimized? It was said before, we need a higher independence of political parties, not the political preconception, but the parties. The key criterion should be skills, qualification, what Mr. Gasser said before. But not just that, also social skills, how they work in teams. I believe this is very decisive. Their willingness to self-reflect and their realization of their own preconceptions of how they see the world. Language skills is another very important factor. Social competence, knowledge of the law, of course. Let me go back to language skills. We have different languages in Switzerland, and therefore the judges need to command the different languages. And life experience, The higher the court, the more experience it takes. We should decouple the system from the party political distribution of seats. There are federal elections every 4 years, political elections. The parliament elections take place every 4th year. And during the course of those 4 years, one can never truly reflect the party political distribution in the courts. So you have that key, that distribution key, and the court's always trying to reflect that, but there is a delay. Sometimes you have to wait for a vacancy, then you can rearrange the seats to reflect the political distribution. It is difficult to completely reflect that, so I believe we should decouple it to some extent. I don't believe that you will create transparency at the federal courts through the judges' political preconceptions. Maybe our German listeners will see this as a surprise. It's not that false, but the composition of courts and their worldviews should also be reflected, as is the case in any population. Maybe we should see to it that the most important political tendencies, trends, parties are reflected, but of course the democratical parties. But in Switzerland, this might be easier to realize because of the concordance democracy that we have. It should be in line with checks and balances. Of course, one could think of a blocking clause. Other states might have such a restrictive clause, but Switzerland has not yet developed this. To say that a certain majority dominated the court, not in Switzerland, I wouldn't say that. Now, term of office, a single term. At the federal court, it's 12 to 15 years without re-election. I believe that would be the most appropriate version. Would have been compensated by removal from office, but of course in line with a legal trial and legal protection. The Judicial Commission of the Federal Assembly could announce elections by public tendering. I agree with what Mr. Gasser said concerning the expert commission. They should revise the nominations, the suggestions, provide them to the Federal Assembly. The expert commission prepares the elections, and they would then, the Federal Assembly that is, could accept the suggestions, but the Federal Assembly could not decide who to nominate. So that would, of course, limit the Federal Assembly's influence. So the Judicial Council would not only be an advisory body, it would, well, I said it before, prepare the election, suggest candidates, and it could be similar to the list that we know from the ECTHR. Of course, you could be member of a political party, but that is not an obligation. But nevertheless, the candidates should disclose their beliefs. This is part of transparency. Otherwise, we will run the risk of appointing a judge, and in the end, you don't agree with the judge's beliefs, because we do not want to do a blind bargain. So they should disclose their beliefs, their views, and this, of course, would play a role in the selection process. Well, prohibition of mandate texts, that's obvious for me. Traditionally speaking, it is different than what someone might see at first glance. With real political mandates, it's the same, be it the executive or be it in the legislative branch. If one assumes mandates and there is a proximity to a political party, but I don't believe this is contemporary anymore. So this will be a new construction site, so to speak. Something that we will have to build, establish. One should also discuss how political parties are financed, but this would be a completely different conference. But the party tax is a question one has to tackle. How would the Judicial Commission be composed? There are different models, of course. Of course, one would need a legal regulation saying that the Judicial Council is independent, legitimized by and through a democratic process, that it's transparent, and of course all that needs to be communicated. As to how this can be implemented, there are different versions. You could say there is a concentrated version with a total of, let's say, 16 seats with judicial experts coming from the Judges Association, faculties, universities, the Bar Association, or an extended version where you would also have non-experts, like representatives from civil society, consumer protection, trade unions. I don't know why the federal court should be heard and consulted. Maybe you can explain that to me. You said it didn't have anything to do with cooptation, but still, you said the federal court should voice its opinion as to who should come. I see it differently. Maybe we can take up this question later. So, who decides who will sit on the Judicial Committee? That's another question. I mean, once you solved one question or one problem, you will be faced with another question. And this is another question. Who will sit on the Judicial Council? So this brings us to a gray area because we never surely know where they come from. So from a democratic perspective, it might be better to have the Federal Council and Federal Assembly vote or elect the Judicial Council. This would, of course, come with a higher level of legitimacy. First, elect the Judicial Council. But I said it before, there are different versions. But the Federal Council could be bound by proposals coming from the represented organizations. So this would be another checks and balances element. How to counterbalance these long terms of office. If one is elected for life or until retirement age, you need proceedings for impeachment. Of course, with clearly defined grounds. These can only be legal grounds, not political grounds. Let's say there is incapacity for office for health reasons or unworthiness of office for reasons of misconduct. We have not yet developed a legal protection system. I believe this would interfere with individual rights if we were to introduce such a system. Who should be responsible for these impeachment trials? It should not be the court itself. It shouldn't be the Federal Assembly either, because otherwise we would add a political element. I'd say it could or should be the Federal Council. The initiative says we need the principle of parallelism. I do not believe this is necessary. But of course, we need to reduce political interference. As to legal protection, we would have a legal court. That would be a new court consisting of members who discharge the office as a second job. You could also have a court of appeals on a constitutional level. I do not believe this is compelling, but one could suggest that. The Justice Court would consist of part-time members elected for one term, adjudicate judicial proceedings, possibly a court of appeal. And now my overview. A federal council appoints the Judicial Council as an expert body bound by the proposals of the represented organizations. The Judicial Commission prepares the election, announces the candidates, goes to the Federal Assembly. They accept it or reject it, but it's bound by the Judicial Commission's suggestions. Affiliation to a political party is not mandatory. You can be a member of a political party, but it's not necessary. It's not compelling. Judges can be removed from their office on grounds of unworthiness of office or incapacity for office. I know that this model is more complex than the one we have right now, but I believe it is necessary. It would come with benefits. Election, re-election, and also removal would be independent from political parties without taking away the democratic feedback. So the Federal Assembly would still be the election body, but with limited powers. The federal courts would still be democratically legitimized. So if this is to be implemented, we need a constitutional revision, because in the Constitution it says that the term of office is 6 years. But I don't believe it's wrong to go through the Constitution. And it's independent, this model, independent of the judicial initiative, the judiciary initiative. It is a block system. You can, like a puzzle that you put together. And I'm not saying that this is the only model that could work. It is one of many different models that could work. But we heard a lot of criticism and skepticism. We can, of course, discuss this later on. And there are two major differences when comparing this to the judiciary initiative. When you stick to the consociational distribution of seats, you still have the representation of different views, but it still upholds and even strengthens the democratic legitimacy, because the election is done by the assembly and not by the drawing of lots, where in the end you wouldn't know who would sit on the council, who would have which mandate and which office. Well, thank you for listening.